Good evening. Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I'm the State Section Director for MUFON LA. Tonight we have a great speaker. His name is Daniel Sheehan. Daniel Sheehan, as a famous civil rights attorney, provided legal counsel for this Karen Silkwood case, the Iran-Contra affair, and the Pentagon Papers. He is the former chief legal counsel to the United States Jesuit headquarters. In Mr. Sheehan's powerfully uplifting, moving lecture tonight, he will articulate information as to the direction in which our UFO movement should direct our efforts in the period between now and 2012. In light of data received by our human family, from the prophets, the experiencers, and from credible members of the UFO movement. Recently, he has been heavily funded by several affluent and powerful individuals so that he may launch an aggressive grassroots UFO movement campaign with an operations venue the size of a college. In closing, a unique spiritual expression will be proffered by Daniel as to the nature of the new eighth paradigm post-contact worldview, which is on our immediate horizon. Everybody put your hands together and welcome tonight Daniel Sheehan.
Thank you very much. In a number of the things that I've done, among some of the things I've done over the past 35 years, one of the things that was of the highest interest to me was I was asked to represent Dr. John Mack, who was the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, who, after having had a number of people sent to him, fairly high-level people, ranking officers in the United States military and others, who had filed reports of having encountered unidentified flying objects, they were sent to get psychiatric evaluations. And being the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, he conducted a number of these and came to realize that what they were saying was in fact true. That after having exhausted the full panoply of psychiatric tests that could be applied to them, he realized that there was a complete consistency to their positions. And so he attempted to write an article to send to the New England Journal of Medicine about this rather extraordinary phenomenon that these people of high positions of authority and responsibility and respect were willing to go so far as to put at risk their entire reputation to come forward to publicly state that they'd had these types of encounters. When he sent the article into the New England Journal of Medicine, they refused to print it. In fact, they sent the assistant editor of the New England Journal of Medicine back with Dr. Mack's article in the folder still, saying that not only were they not going to publish it, they weren't even going to allow the board of editors to read it. And John said to them, well, does it need more footnotes? Do you want me to give more data? What is it that you'd like me to do in order to get this published? I mean, after all, John was a Pulitzer Prize winner. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. He had a number of publications, was the chairman of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. What is it you need me to do in order to publish this? And the assistant editor said that I've been informed, I've been instructed to tell you by the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. John Relman, that under no circumstances will this be published by the New England Journal of Medicine. So John contacted a number of publishers and was a little upset about this and just had it published in the form of a book, which was called Abductions, Human Encounters with Aliens. And almost immediately subsequent to the publication of this, as it began to, the news began to go out around the country about the publication of this book, John was contacted by the head of the department of at the medical school, the dean of the medical school, and asked to come and make a presentation about his work to the certain faculty members. Well, when John came to the meeting, which he expected to be rather friendly, interesting meeting of the faculty, it turned out that it was an ad hoc faculty committee that had been assembled and we're sitting there in full array with the legal counsel from Harvard University as a sitting member, and the committee was actually chaired by Dr. John Relman, the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, who had rejected his article in the first place. And when he realized that the questioning was turning into an interrogation and a set of implied charges against him, he communicated with a number of friends of his about what the dilemma was that he found himself in. And one of these was Ron Robertson, who was a dear friend of John's, who had been in the Air Force with him during the Korean War and had been his best man at his wedding 20 years earlier. And Ron was a major supporter of the Christic Institute, of which I was the president and general counsel, and it was the 501c3 public interest organization through which we had done the Karen Silkwood case and the 3 Mile Island litigation and the Iran-Contra case and others. And Ron Robertson had been a major supporter of ours, and so when John called him and explained his dilemma, Ron said to him, "What about having Dan Sheehan represent you in front of the faculty?" Dan, went to Harvard College and graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School and did his master's work and stuff then later some PhD work at the Divinity School. How about having him represent you? And John said, "Well, he did all the big Iran-Contra stuff. I'm not sure he'd be interested in, something like this. It's a rather strange topic." And so Ron said, I'll find out. I'll call Dan and have him come over to dinner. So he had me come over to dinner with Helen and he, and we had dinner. And as we got to dessert, he said, "Dan, do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" And I said, "No, sure, go ahead, Ron." He said, "What do you think about this issue of, there being extraterrestrial intelligence and this issue of these UFOs that have been seen around?" And I said to him that I think that's one of the most important issues that there is, and that it really needs professional investigation and responsible handling. And so he said, he was kind of flabbergasted, and he said, "Well, let me tell you about my friend." And he did, and so John contacted me and asked me to represent him. And that's how one of the contacts I had with this interesting subject. And as you may know, John very recently was tragically killed when he was struck and killed by a car on the streets of London right after his final lecture on T.E. Lawrence at Oxford University. And when struck down and killed in the midst of his lecturing and writing books and doing investigations, and I was struck by this, how the irony of the fact that John had been struck down in this mundane auto accident, highway accident, virtually just like T.E. Lawrence, just like Lawrence of Arabia, who had been killed in this mundane motorcycle crash after living this heroic and indeed archetypal life. And I was struck by the irony of this, and it raised for me this kind of profound question that many of us face when people who are dear to us are struck down like that without notice. And especially those who die in some kind of mundane way, in an otherwise absolutely archetypal life like that. And so it raises those profound questions of what it is that each of us is here to do, and what we can accomplish in the limited number of 70 to 100 years that we each get. And so that this type of profound question that strikes us in these kind of instances may seem a bit like a peculiar lead-in to the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the meaning of the UFO experience. But on the other hand, perhaps not, because of the same motivation that causes us as individuals to often turn our attention away from this type of a profound question of what our purpose is here in life and what the ultimate objective of our life is and what we might accomplish during our life, is the same kind of inclination that causes us as a collective of people to turn away from these profound questions about the ultimate purpose of our entire species and what we might achieve during the period that we have here in this incarnation. And this same kind of refusal to face these kind of profound questions is that very same kind of motivation that causes so many really intelligent people to not only refuse to come to grips with this question about the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, but indeed causes intelligent and otherwise responsible people to actually ridicule and excoriate individuals who in fact attempt to look into this particular question. So, for example, as happened with Dr. Mack, and not only Dr. John Relman, but the entire board of the faculty at Harvard University, the seat of rational learning. And that in fact, they went so far as, I'll give you an example. When I appeared with Dr. Mack in front of the committee, Dr. Relman and all of them were assembled up there, and they began to start right out on this kind of attacking interrogation of him again. And I said, excuse me, Dr. Relman, can you tell me, exactly what is it we're doing here? What's the purpose of our being here in this particular set of meetings? And Dr. Relman said, well, Mr. Sheehan, he said, when Dr. Mack wrote this book, Abductions, Human Encounters with Aliens, the dean of the medical school began to get a lot of phone calls and inquiries, and they were asking questions about Dr. Mack's book. And he was unable to answer any of these questions. And so he thought, we might gather some of the faculty together and ask some questions of Dr. Mack, and so to assist the dean in answering some of these questions. And so I said, if that's the purpose that we're here, we need to focus on that. Can you tell me exactly who it was that made these phone calls? And he said, I don't believe I'm at liberty to discuss that. And I said, well, if the questions that they were asking is what we're supposed to be directing our attention to getting answers to here, what were the kind of questions they were asking? And he said, I don't think I'm at liberty to discuss that. And so I said, well, look, could you at least tell me? I said, do you think that during the course of these hearings that either of the two following fact questions might be at issue? Number one, whether extraterrestrial intelligence actually exists elsewhere in the universe. And secondly, whether at least some of these sightings of UFOs at different places, at least some of them might actually be vehicles from an extraterrestrial civilization that were actually here on our Earth. Are either of those two fact questions possibly going to be at issue here during the course of these hearings? And Dr. Relman said, well, they absolutely are. And it's absolutely ridiculous to think that either one of those things can possibly be true. So there wasn't the slightest intention of being open to addressing these questions. And so this is an example of the type of closed-mindedness and indeed the type of ridicule and persecution that is undertaken of any individual who even so much as approaches this particular question. But my purpose tonight is not to go on at length about that type of problem in our culture. My purpose is to really explore the actual content of the answers to these two profound questions, so that we might be able to together help seek an answer to these questions, so that at least we who are here won't come to some type of an abrupt and unexpected end in our own individual lives without having come really to grips with this question and trying to understand what its implications are. Now, at the outset of the discussion of this kind of a profound set of questions, I think it's important for us at the outset to take note of the fact that the particular position that people take with regard to these two questions, and they might actually be kind of taken together as one really profound question about the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence and the meaning of this UFO experience, that take note of the fact that the position that a person takes on this profound question is very much operationally determined by their worldview. Now, I've discussed this before when I've been asked at a number of places to discuss this issue of the worldviews. I've talked about it at the International Symposium at MUFON in 2001 when I was asked. But at that time, there were a large number of people, those of us who've been invited to speak there. You know, Dr. John Mack was there, and Bud Hopkins was there, and a number, there were like several of us there. So I didn't really have a full opportunity to go into detail about what the implications of these worldviews really were. But I did point out that when I was privileged to be asked to serve as the director for the Gorbachev Foundation at the end of the Cold War, to serve as the director of the strategic initiative to attempt to identify a new post-Cold War paradigm, to try to replace, at the end of the Cold War, these two fundamentally dialectical worldviews that had dominated our entire planet for almost the entire 20th century. On the one hand, the anti-capitalism of the East and the anti-communism of the West. It seemed that we ought to be able to, now with the sudden end of the Cold War, on December 31st of 1991, we ought to be able to gather together and take the opportunity of this opening to attempt to identify some new paradigm, some new non-dialectical worldview, pursuant to which people could work together in a cooperative way to live together on the planet. In that vein, we gathered together over a 5-year period over 2,000 former presidents of countries, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, foreign ministers, CEOs of major corporations, United Nations officials, heads of religious organizations, the heads of 501c3 public interest organizations, to carry out this discussion, to seek to identify such a new paradigm. And I pointed out at the International Symposium that we had come to identify during that process the existence of an entire octave of worldviews. Not just one worldview or just two worldviews, but an entire octave of worldviews. And that we realized that 7 of these 8 worldviews had actually been in operation in one civilization or another over the last 2,500 years. And that what we discovered was that each of these categorically distinct worldviews had its own totally distinctive answer to a set of very clear, fundamental, and profound questions that each individual has to ask herself or himself, at least unconsciously, during the course of their life. And that it was the categorically distinctive answers that were provided to this list of questions that actually generated these categorically distinct worldviews. And that what we discovered is that these fundamental questions, the fundamental question of, basically, where did we come from? How did this entire physical universe actually come into being? This is identified as the cosmological question. What is the cosmology that we find ourselves in? How did it come into being? And what are the laws of physics, the operational laws pursuant to which it functions and presumably has functioned throughout time and presumably will continue to function in the future? The second of these profound questions is what they call the teleological question, and that is, where exactly are we going, or what's the meaning of all of this? Is there any particular discernible direction in which the universe is unfolding? Is there some sort of ultimate parousia or objective toward which this is all unfolding? That's the teleological question. A third profound question is the question of how did consciousness arise from this otherwise obviously unconscious mud and rocks and sticks and things that are unconscious. How did this experience that we are experiencing of consciousness, as we ride around up here behind our eyeballs and watch the world and are reflective of our consciousness, how did that consciousness actually come into being out of this inert matter? And then a fourth fundamental question is, exactly what tools do we have at our disposal as human beings by means of which we could possibly answer cosmic questions like that? And this is known as the epistemological question. It's just a big fancy word for the same thing, is what are the tools that we have at our disposal? Are we limited to just what we can see and touch and taste and feel and hear and use our intelligence to kind of gather together? Or are there some other means that we have at our disposal? For example, do we have some sixth faculty? Is there some sort of intuitive faculty that we have access to that is evolving over time, that is increasing? Do some people have more of this than others, by means of which they can intuitively discern the answer to these profound questions? And of course, a fifth important fundamental question is that when you answer all of these questions, what is the ultimate mode of ethical reasoning that you use? Once you figure the answer to these questions out, what mode of ethical reasoning does this generate in you so that you then use it to make some decision as to what's good or bad? Or what conduct is better or best? Or better or worse than another choice that you would have? This is the ultimate question of the mode of ethical reasoning. And of course, when you take these five and you put them together, if you get a consistent set of answers, an internally self-referential, consistent set of answers to these questions, then this will generate, of course, a philosophy. And this is where philosophies come from. And, most of us have all been bored to tears by encountering philosophy whenever you've had to encounter it, in reading Hegel and Nietzsche and Heidegger and the others, and because you can't figure out what the hell they're talking about, or even why they're talking about it. And so that without some kind of a more cosmic grounding of what the questions are, which they're trying to address, you can't really figure out why it's worth your while to read them. And of course, derivative of the philosophy that is generated by each of these categorically distinct worldviews is the political philosophy of that worldview. Now, this is one that we start to recognize a little bit more. This is that we recognize the difference between an authoritarian and a reactionary, and between a reactionary and a conservative, and between a conservative and a moderate, and between a moderate and a liberal, and between a liberal and a progressive, and between a progressive and a utopian person. We recognize these political philosophies as categorically distinct, but we don't often reflect upon what it is that causes them to have these different positions. But what it is the different answers that are given to these fundamental questions. And so that we discover also, very importantly, that there are categorically distinct modes of spiritual expression that are generated. We know that there's a Christian mode of spiritual expression, and a Hindu mode of spiritual expression, and a Hebrew mode of spiritual expression, and a Buddhist mode of... We run into these all the time, and we keep looking at them. We say, I wonder why there's a whole octave of these. And why, therefore, are there entire different cultures or social forms that are generated by these different worldviews. So it's important for us to understand that depending upon the worldview that one has, one will in fact tend to answer these fundamental questions, these new questions that come up in a fundamentally different way that is consistent with one's worldview. Now, I could go on and on about these worldviews, but that's not the purpose that we're really here tonight for. Indeed, I do go on about this as a rule, and will go on about it in a book that's going to be available next year that is called Paradigm Politics, The Clash of Worldviews and the Remaking of the American Political Order at the End of the Cold War. But as I say, that what we're here tonight to do is just to simply take note of this fact, of the effect of these worldviews on our answer to these profound questions about the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence and the meaning of the UFO experience, so that we can direct our attention to recognizing why it is that our answer to these two profound questions is so very important for each of us to come to before we find ourselves surprisingly struck down in the middle of our life. Because those of us who answer these two specific questions in a specific way causes us to, in fact, be the introductory agents to an entirely new eighth worldview that is categorically different than the other seven worldviews that have been consistently engaged in throughout recorded history of our human family. It is actually the opening onto not only another worldview, but it in fact is the coming to exercise this worldview and to hold a certain internally consistent set of beliefs that are derivative of this worldview actually cause us to be transitional agents into transitioning from our present species of Homo sapien into the next evolutionary step of our entire human family, of evolving from Homo sapien into Homo galacticus. And so therefore it becomes very important for us to understand what this new worldview is and what the implications of it are, and what the specific answers are that we have for these two profound questions based upon this worldview. And so that's what I wish to address tonight. What is this, the answer? What are the answers to these two fundamental questions that we tend to share in a way that's profoundly different from adherence to these other worldviews? I'd like to briefly context it by the obvious context of what the answer to these questions are by some of these other worldviews. Let's take first the classic fourth paradigm worldview of scientific logical positivism, the classic Aristotelian worldview that we're taught in most of the public schools and most of the colleges, that you have to follow a scientific logical positivist worldview. And therefore the answer to these two questions are that, well, the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence hasn't yet been proven yet by a scientifically verifiable form. You can't weigh it. You haven't been able to capture one and show it to us and weigh them and dissect them and measure them and find a material proof of that and weigh it. And so therefore, it doesn't exist. It's a really strange kind of worldview that nothing exists except that which you can measure and weigh and have material proof of. Now, the peculiar fact is that this particular worldview is buttressed by a strange operational assistant, which even ironically, non-rationally, rejects real material proof and real replicable evidence. And one of the examples of which, of course, is Dr. John Relman that I just told you. They don't even want to hear it. They don't want anybody to present the information to them. And I'll give you one other example of a classic manifestation of this. And this is one of the other things that I've done. I was legal counsel to the Disclosure Project. As you know, back in 2001, we gathered together some 24 government officials and brought them to Washington, D.C., and prepared them to answer under oath, to testify before Congress, to give information of their own firsthand personal knowledge of the existence of the proof that there was a major cover-up going on inside the government about the existence of these vehicles. And one of the witnesses there that I went through and we chose to present to the people in Washington was Commander Graham Bethune. And some of you may have heard of him before, but he tells an extraordinarily interesting story that after the end of World War II, he was assigned to be the pilot to fly some dozen scientific experts from the United States up to Newfoundland. That there had been some sightings of strange vehicles in the air around Newfoundland. And there was a suspicion that they might be some new Russian experiment. And so there were these dozen scientists that were going up to look at this, and Commander Bethune was the pilot of the plane, and he had his pilot and navigator and co-pilot, and they were flying. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. They're flying along over the ocean to go up to Newfoundland, and he's piloting the plane, and he looks out through the windshield of the aircraft, and he sees this big circle of lights way down on the water, and it looks just like a town down there. And he's kind of confused, and he turns to his navigator, and he says, look, looks like a town down here. There's not supposed to be any town here. We're supposed to be out over the ocean. Check our bearings, if you would, again, to make sure we're on course. They went ahead and did that, and they were on course. And so they looked down again, and just as they did, this town basically flashes up off the water, and within just like a second appears full-blown right in front of them, in front of the airplane, and it's a huge, gigantic flying saucer. It's the size of a football field right in front of them. And so Commander Bethune, as the pilot, noses the plane down and sends it into this big steep dive to keep from running into the thing. And the UFO moves off to the side and sits off about 300 yards away from them. And he levels the plane back out and is just hovering there. And he's looking at it and he says, well, this was a kind of a sudden dive here. I better go back and check on our passengers and see that they're okay. So he turns over the control to the co-pilot, and he goes back into the passenger compartment. He goes back in there, and 11 of the 12 people are all kind of riveted to the side of the plane, looking out the window at this thing, staring at this thing sitting out there. But there's this one guy who's just standing here like this. And Commander Bethune goes over to him and he says, are you okay? Are you okay? And he says, yes, I'm okay. And Commander Bethune said, do you see that out there? Do you see what's out there like that? And the guy turns to him and he says, I'm a scientist. I don't believe in those things. I'm not looking. So that, and of course there's the kind of recent updating and modification of this classic fourth paradigm, scientific, logical, positivist worldview, and that's by like Carl Sagan. And what he says is that, well, on this question of whether extraterrestrial civilization exists, it might. Given the fact that there are billions and billions and billions of stars out there, he said. But the fact is, it doesn't really make any difference because they're all so far away and they can't go faster than the speed of light. Nothing can go faster than the speed of light, anything that's material at all. So there's no possible way they can get here within any kind of lifetime of that. And so it's an interesting academic issue, but it has absolutely no functional reality at all. So for all intents and purposes, they don't exist. And surely the UFO reports are not vehicles from these other star systems coming to visit us. Now it's very important because this fourth paradigm scientific logical positivist worldview is the one that claims to be the dominant operative worldview in our Western civilization at the present time. There's one other worldview we ought to touch upon before, just in contexting our own worldview. And that is the dialectical worldview, because unfortunately, despite all our most gallant efforts at the end of the Cold War to try to generate a new non-dialectical, non-confrontational worldview to supplant the dialectical worldview of anti-communism and anti-capitalism, the forces of the dialectical worldview have risen into the ascendancy and seem to be in control of the administration again. And they now have defined a new ultimate other, and that is that we're surrounded by terrorists everywhere. And so the entire operational principle is anti-terrorism. It used to be anti-communism, now it's anti-terrorism. And the terrorists are everywhere all around us. They're everywhere, they're all around us. Well, that has something to do with the fact that we're sitting in the middle of their country. That aside, they attacked us. Well, it is true that they attacked us after we were planning to attack them. I mean, it is clear now that everybody knows, that everybody's testified now that the Bush administration was planning to attack Afghanistan and Iraq from the very day they came into office. They were working up the military plans to do so. But what the matter? The fact is, it all started when these people hit us back. And so that this dialectical worldview is an important one. So how do adherents to the dialectical worldview answer these questions? What they say is, when they see one of these UFOs, what they say right away is, holy mackerel, I want to have me one of them. That can make a great weapon. I can use this to fly faster, and I can drop bombs anywhere and get away. This is fantastic. I got to get one of these things for a weapon.
And of course, their second response to it is, what a super ultimate other these people are. If we happen to run out of terrorists, these people are going to make the best ultimate other we can possibly have for a new dialectical worldview to justify spending $600 billion a year on military stuff. I mean, these people are the absolute king threat of all time. So when we run out of terrorists, which I might point out probably isn't going to be any too soon, that when we run out of terrorists, we can shift over to these guys. And so that's the reaction. I mean, when faced with this kind of awesome, absolutely astonishing, potential reality, with all of its positive potential implications, the dialectical worldview adherents have that kind of a reaction. It's sort of a variation on the old Sufi aphorism that when a pickpocket meets a saint, all that he sees are his pockets. And then there are other worldviews. The seventh paradigm theistic worldview, for example, the major proponents of this being the International Global Catholic Christian Church, now under the authority of Joseph Ratzinger. Their particular view of this is, well, look at if these actually exist, why then that really destroys the entire centrality of the human family in the middle of the entire universe. It was bad enough not having the earth be the center of the entire universe, but at least we had the holdout that at least we were the center of the universe in the unfolding of consciousness in the material universe. And so if these other beings exist, why then we don't have a central role anymore. So therefore it's heresy to say that these other beings exist. And that's kind of a functional response of their particular worldview. So that you see that there are all these, again, one could go on and on about this and list out all the worldviews and their response, but what's our answer to these two profound and important questions that's so categorically distinct and important that it actually constitutes the potential transition into an entirely new worldview, and in turn, a transition into the entire next step of evolution of our entire human family? Let me briefly give you what my answer has come to be to these questions. And I think that when we discuss this carefully, you'll come to see that it's probably pretty much the answer that we've come to as a community on this. Now, just briefly, my own particular history on this thing is you've heard some of the stuff before, that I represented John Mack, and I've been the chief counsel for the Disclosure Project. And you've probably heard, too, that I served worked with the United States Congressional Research Service back when President Carter asked to have the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the meaning of the UFO phenomenon investigated. And I worked with the Congressional Research Service, the Science and Technology Division, to look into this. And so that I've had some experience with this. But in my opinion, where my own personal experience with this really started was back as early as when I was only 5 years old. You're not going to hear a great big UFO abduction story here. I better warn you off on that at the beginning. But like when I was 5 years old and I was out playing in the leaves in my home in Gansevoort, New York, up in northern New York in the Adirondacks. I remember it was in the fall and we were out playing in the leaves out in the yard and having this great time. And I went in the house and went upstairs to go to the bathroom. I go upstairs in the bathroom and I look out of the window and there's all the kids down in the yard playing. They're all running around in the leaves and still playing, and their heads are all filled with winning the game and getting into the game. And I'm sitting here, and all of a sudden I'm looking down, and I say to myself, holy mackerel, I was right down there just a minute ago. And I was doing all of that kind of stuff down there, and I never thought about anybody being up here kind of looking down at us all like that. This is kind of interesting. This is a really interesting kind of perspective on all of this. And so I reflected upon that, and then in the following summer, when we moved to Fort Ann, when I was 5 years old, the first time I could sort of be outdoors at dark at nighttime, I was sitting in the big grassy field or big grassy yard by our house. I looked up and I saw all of these big stars, man. And I looked up and I was saying, wow, I mean, these are like suns, these are like star systems, and there's planets going around these things, and there's people on these things, and they're all down there looking down on us like this, seeing us down here playing in the leaves and doing all the things that we do down here, where we get caught up just like we did as little kids and trying to win the game of playing in the leaves. And we're playing these little games of here's my country and your country, and you can't have that, and give me this. And I said, this is really extraordinary. If one could only maintain the perspective of that kind of an opinion about what we're really doing here, so that you wouldn't get caught up in this kind of false absolute dedication to some kind of artificial short-term objective that you've got, losing track of who we really are here. That would be really helpful. So I've tried throughout my life to each night go out beneath the stars, whether it's walking Sophie, my dog, or getting some excuse to go out into the night each night, to walk beneath the stars and find a star and just focus on it and let it sit there and pulse down and understand that there are planets probably going around that star, and to try to get a perspective of not taking too seriously this game of playing in the leaves that we do at any given time, whether it's in our business or our corporation or our political party or what it is that we're doing, but to keep a perspective of the stars on us at all times. And this led me, when I got to the end of high school, to want to be an astronaut. And so I worked very hard, and I became the candidate for the United States Air Force Academy. I figured they fly airplanes, I'll be an astronaut. And bottom line is that I got all the way to being interviewed by Senator Jacob Javits, the Republican United States Senator from New York, to see whether I was going to get the senatorial appointment. And he asked me, he said, Master Sheehan, he said, why do you want to be an astronaut? And so I told him. I said, I want to get to go out here where all these other beings are, to get to be part of the whole adventure of getting out here to have contact with these other beings. And it's just absolutely astonishing, the opportunities that we have here. And there was this big deafening silence. And Jacob Javits kind of looked at me and he said, isn't there some kind of more practical reason why you want to be an astronaut? And I said, well, you assume if these people can travel all the way here in these UFOs and come here and stuff, then they must have gotten successfully through their entire era of nuclear weapons. And they've figured out a way to do it without killing themselves and stuff like that. And they may be able to tell us how they did that, so we don't have to relive what we did last fall in 1962, in the fall, in October, of almost coming to the point of killing ourselves totally with nuclear weapons. And so he was just kind of dumbfounded like that. And he said, so it turns out he'd already given the appointment to the Air Force Academy to somebody else. And so he ended up offering me the appointment to the Naval Academy. And I said, I'm not into boats, I'm into airplanes. And so I was going to take the appointment from the congressional office, but he gave it to the son of the mayor of Glens Falls, and so I didn't get it. So I said, holy mackerel. I said, I better become a lawyer. Things aren't working like they're supposed to work here. I said, I know what the rules were, and I knew that I was ahead of these guys in getting this appointment. They're not supposed to do this. So I figured that somehow the whole tune that we were supposed to be all playing according to here in the country, that it was a little bit out of tune, that there were some people that were a little out of tune here. And so that I'd have to be a lawyer for a little while, I could get this thing kind of tuned back up, and then I could get back to being an astronaut and getting to going into outer space and get to meet these people. But what I discovered when I came out was that it wasn't that it was just a few people being a little bit out of tune here. It turns out that they were playing an entirely different song than we'd all been taught, that we were all supposed to be participating in. When I came out, I was just astonished. I got to go to this big law firm in New York on Wall Street, the big #1 law firm in the entire world, and got to be the lawyer for the Pentagon Papers, for the New York Times. I looked in the Pentagon Papers, 47 volumes of these classified documents, and said, holy mackerel, this is a total big fat lie. This whole thing that they've been telling us, all the thousands of hours on the television, Dan Rather in the foxholes telling us, here we are trying to save these people in this democracy here down in South Vietnam, and turns out that it was all just a huge big fat lie. Turns out that there was never even any attack in the Bay of Tonkin on the USS Henry Knox, the radar picket destroyer. It was all complete fabrication. And there it is, all the cables going back and forth saying we had to have something like a Pearl Harbor to get our people really excited. And maybe if we could get these people to shoot at us, maybe we could say they attacked us. And they sent the USS Henry Knox up and down the coast shooting big 12-inch guns onto the shore trying to get them to attack them. And they wouldn't. And so they said, well, let's just say they did. you know. And so I was completely flabbergasted by this. And then I discovered that the New York Times had historically been concealing information like this, that they knew all about, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and they knew all about this, but they'd been meeting with people from both Republican and Democratic administrations, and here's the newspaper that's supposed to be printing all the news is fit to print, and that they've been concealing information, working hand in glove with the administrations, concealing information from our people. So not only could you not trust the Republican or the Democratic Party, you couldn't even trust the New York Times. And then I end up going to F. Lee Bailey's office, and I'm in F. Lee Bailey's office when we're doing the Watergate burglary case. You know, we're representing James McCord, the wiretap specialist in the place, and so I find out all about what's going on in the Watergate burglary. You know, why they were in there, why they were putting the wiretaps into Larry O'Brien's office, and all this kind of stuff. And like nobody wanted to admit what they were doing. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Republicans didn't want to talk about it. Democrats didn't want to talk about it. Senate didn't want to talk about it. The House didn't want to talk about it. CIA didn't want to talk about it. You know, and then they get when Alexander Butterfield told Scott Armstrong that they had these tape recorders going in the White House. You know, they couldn't tell whether they were glad about that or not. And they end up with the June 23rd conversation where Bob Haldeman and John Dean come into the president's office. You know, and I'm sitting here listening to these things, and they walk in, and he says. John Dean says to the president, he says, President Nixon, he said, I'm afraid we got a problem here. And Nixon says, what is it, John? He said, well, I just got a call from Pat Gray, you know, the new head of the FBI, and they've been asked to investigate these checks that they found in Bernard Barker's pocket, one of the burglars. And it's a check written from the Committee to Re-elect the President. It's written on a bank, the Banco Internacional, down in Mexico City, from some account, some lawyer by the name of Osario. And they want the FBI to investigate that. And he wants to know whether that's going to cause any trouble. So there's a big long silence on the tape, and John Dean says, or Nixon says to John Dean, says, John, I want you to go see Vernon Walters and Dick Helms over at the agency and have them go over and see the FBI and tell them to get the hell out of this investigation right now. And John Dean says to him, well, Mr. President, what am I supposed to tell them to say? And he says, well, you have Vern tell him, and Dick Helms tell him, he said, you have him tell the FBI, if they don't get out of this right now, why then all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out. And John Dean says to him, well, will they know what that means? And he said, oh, yes, they'll know what that means. And when Bob Haldeman was asked later by Senator Sam Ervin of the Watergate Select Committee, what did that mean? What was he talking about? And Bob Haldeman said, well, I think they were talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. At which point there was just a complete dead silence, and they went on to the next thing, just like that. But let it be said in short that that is exactly what they were talking about. And that's exactly what the Watergate break-in was all about, and the concealing of all of that. And so when I found that out, I said, wait a second, this just goes from bad to worse. I mean, this is way out of control. And so I ended up going to divinity school. And I went to divinity school and studied comparative social ethics, and then ended up getting to go down to the Jesuit National Headquarters, to their National Office of Social Ministry, to work with them down there on helping to work on public policy positions from a more profound position, one that was in accordance with the song that we had learned when we were younger, that is supposed to be true. The song of the prophets, the song of the people who have learned how to live in accordance with right living. And so I got to do that and work on that for a while. And it was in that context where I was contacted by Marcia Smith, who was the head of the Science and Technology Committee of the subdivision of the Congressional Research Service, because President Carter had asked to have the extraterrestrial intelligence issue and UFO issue looked into. And she contacted me originally to ask me whether I could get the Vatican Library to give access to what's in the Vatican Library about extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. And so I agreed to do that and to undertake steps to do that. And much to my chagrin, the Vatican Library refused. And so I said, oh, there must be some mistake here, and I wrote them another letter saying, here, let me tell you, explain this a little bit more. We want this, and the President Carter wants this, and he wants to, and they still said no. And so I had to tell Marcia, oh, we can't get this, And so she called me back a little while later, and she said, look, the Congress has cut half of the money for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the SETI program out at JPL, and we need to have somebody try to go over to the Hill and talk with some Congress people to get them to put this money back in. And so I went over with a few other people, a couple of astronauts and other people, went over and met with them all, and they put the money back. And so she said, oh, it's great, they put the money back. The people at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at SETI want you to come out and talk to them and do a presentation to them about the religious implications of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And so I was privileged to get to go and do a 3-hour closed-door briefing to the top 50 scientists of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence at the JPL. And so I've done a few of these things down through the years, and it's on the basis of this that I have actually, come to have a certain set of opinions about what this is, including interviewing the people that John Mack knew, the many experiencers, and the people that were available as candidates for the Disclosure Project, etc. So my answer to these questions is that I've set forth is, with regard to the first one, the first fundamental question about the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, I simply take the same position that the Congressional Research Service ended up taking, actually, and filed in an official report to President Carter, and that is that based upon all of their research and undertakings, they had come to the conclusion that there's a 90% probability that there exist at least from 2 to 6 other highly intelligent, highly technologically developed, other civilizations right in our own galaxy other than ours. Now a lot of people say, oh, well, that's a minimal position. Yeah, but it's a position that is categorically different than the positions that's been taken by every one of the other worldviews. And to say that in fact there is now this reality is so profoundly important that my position is that I simply take that position, because I was fortunate enough to participate to some extent in that particular preparation, gave it to the President, and so I take that position. Now people ask me, what about this phenomenon of the UFOs? And I was asked about this at the International UFO Congress, and I gave a brief presentation in which I pointed out that there are, not surprisingly, you won't be surprised to know this, that there are at least 7 different potential explanations for this. That, for example, one can argue that at least some of these sightings, some of these contact experiences are in fact solid or energy form vehicles that have been in fact made at and flown by, piloted by members of one of these or another of these 2 to 6 other intelligent civilizations right here in our own galaxy. That they're of this time dimension, they're of this physical dimension, and they're here. There's a second group of these sightings that we see and encounter, that a significant number of them perhaps, that in fact are United States government experimental aircraft that have in fact been manufactured here on our planet based upon back engineering of crashed saucers or saucers that have been shot down and taken into custody, and that the United States government, working with major members of the military-industrial defense complex, are attempting to back engineer and fly these things. And that and some other of these may have also been developed by projecting Tesla-like technology that we know about. Way back in the 40s, there was all kinds of stuff being written about the anti-gravity studies that were being done, the extraordinary things that they were discovering about this, and then all of a sudden it came completely silent. So the second category of some of these experiences that are going on, the sightings, I believe are in fact secret U.S. government experimental aircraft. There's a third category of these, I think, which is a very important group of them, that are intentionally planted PSYOPs incidents, that are psychological operations that are being conducted by some as yet unidentified covert operation of the United States military intelligence complex that are in fact attempting to give people the impression that they've been abducted or they're having these kind of experiences, and that they're expressly designed to be used as a cover so that when it's found out that they're doing this, they can then say that explains all of them. And that they've been doing this only to try to test how people might react when they encounter this, if this ever happens in some far distant future time. Now this is a little complex. It's got 2 or 3 steps to it, like all disinformation activities, but it's an attempt to generate false experiences so they can pretend that all the experiences are false, so they can use that to further postpone having to acknowledge that they know perfectly well that the vehicles are here. Okay, and I think that it's also important to think that some of these contacts, some of these experiences that people have, may well be, in my opinion, may well be some type of form of a time travel phenomenon. That it is entirely possible that we will, in the distant future or not so distant future, be able to discover how to transcend time. And it may be that some of these contacts are actual human beings from the future coming back into the present time, attempting to warn us away from certain types of conduct that we're engaging in right at this really critical point in time, such as the development of nuclear weapons and the massive contamination of our planet and the genetic engineering that is now starting to become very prominent. Now, I think that there's also the possibility that some of these, and I think some of them may well be, the most peculiar of these explanations is one that I've come to now know that is adhered to both by Carl Jung and is adhered to by Whitley Striebeler and by Jacques Vallée, much to my surprise, but that they actually, Jung actually wrote an article. He asserted that he believes that there is such a critical mass of human beings now among us who have become so unconsciously terrified that our human family is going to do something with the genetic engineering or the mutations through the working with nuclear materials, etc., that we're going to do something profoundly disastrous to ourselves, and that it's going to cause us to be mutated in the future. And that because of this, what we have done is we have collectively generated a nightmare in our own collective unconscious about what was going to happen into the future, and that we have projected this out through a focused collective unconscious intention into a photoplasmic reality that actually manifests. Now this is rather an extraordinary position. And Jung actually wrote a major article in 1958 about it called A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky that was published by Princeton University. And it turns out that this is in fact what Whitley ends up believing, and so does Jacques Vallée. Now, and then there's a final one that some of these may well be, I know things like the sightings, the people of apparitions of Mary at Medjugorje and at Fatima and some of these other places may be in a category of what they call genuine spiritual experiences. Whatever that might be, that they're beings of light of some really special kind of nature that manifest and that have a profoundly, clearly ethical implication to their appearances. And some people attribute them to being from the Pleiades and others, but that they fall into an interesting category of spiritual experiences. But as I said back when I was asked to talk about this back in 2001, I don't think that it's correct to people get into saying, no, this is the answer, or that's the answer, and you're wrong, and I'm right. That it strikes me that each one of these perspectives on what these phenomena really are, or some portion of them, may explain some portion of what's happening. Based on my 35 years as a professional investigator, having investigated cases like the Karen Silkwood case and who killed her and who was smuggling the plutonium out of that facility at Kerr-McGee in Oklahoma, and my investigation of the Iran-Contra crisis and a lot of the others that you've heard about, my experience is that when you really get right down to it, you discover, lo and behold, that there's a series of things that come into play, and they interact with each other to generate an explanation for something that isn't quite as simple as you thought it was at the very beginning, and that there's an interplay of two or three things that come together to happen. And that I think that what we're seeing is the interaction of a number of these different kind of experiences taking place. And then the community gets into trying to figure out which one is the right answer. And if anybody disagrees with them and offers another suggestion, they basically attack them and get into these kind of interpersonal squabbles that take place, etc. But what I want to say, including on this point, is that my own personal opinion is that 95% of all of these different sightings and experiences, these encounters, are explained, in my opinion, by only 3 of these range of 7 options. And that is that I believe that the majority of these are, in fact, actual vehicles, solid or energy-formed vehicles that have, in fact, been generated from other civilizations and are here actually encountering us. And I believe that as much as maybe 40% of these experiences that people have are instead U.S. government experimental aircraft. And that perhaps 5% of these things are these PSYOPs operations where they're actually attempting to get people to think they've had the experience so they can pretend they're all that fake experience. Now, when you put these together and you get 95% of all of these, what they do is they triangulate in on a very interesting reality. And that is that there are beings from 2 to 6 other civilizations of highly intelligent, highly technologically developed civilizations actually contacting us and visiting us here on the planet. And secondly, that our government knows about it. And that our government, thirdly, is actively engaged in a conscious campaign to try to conceal this from us. Even to the point of going so far as actively and aggressively trying to discredit people that they know are telling the truth. And so this is an important reality because I believe that they're probably doing this during a period of time when they are at the same time attempting to develop some type of weapon system by means of which they can actually fight these people from another civilization. Now this constitutes a very substantial public policy problem. To have people in a tiny minority like this in control of the government, concealing such a profoundly important question, so completely pregnant with potential positive consequences, and yet transmuting it into a potential threat of a major military confrontation with civilizations that are extraordinarily beyond our present means. And so that I think that in fact this constitutes a public policy question that requires careful consideration. And again, but this also isn't the point of my conversation tonight. It's really to try to figure out what the implications of these answers are for purposes of bringing us to a new worldview. A new worldview that can constitute the potential transition into a whole new step in our evolutionary phase. So that I believe that what I want to do, and just in closing on this point, within the time limits that we were talking about, I want to just point out what I believe that when we answer these 2 profoundly important questions in this way, this special way that we do, that distinguishes our answers from the answers that are provided by adherents to these other worldviews, that it actually leads us to a set of worldviews which are so profoundly different that we need to really address what that is. And what I believe is that this particular worldview, this 8th paradigm worldview that we need to look at now, if I can figure out how I put it on my cards here, so I can do it as fast as I can. That what I think is that, I don't think I'm going to be able to find this. I was trying to be so cute on doing this. But the bottom line is, I think that what we're really looking at here, from the cosmological point of view, is we're looking at a cosmology here that is, in fact, a stacked set of octaves. That what we really come to see is that in the particular dimension that we live in, that we live in a particular, we manifest as material confluences of mass and energy and consciousness in a particular band of spectrum of the electromagnetic field, such that we are not capable of actually experientially encountering the vibrational frequency of light below a certain frequency of infrared light, or above a certain frequency of ultraviolet light. And so our world, our manifest world, is that which we can see. It exists within a certain narrow frame of vibrational frequency. And it manifests itself in 8 primary experiences of color. From the red to the orange, to the yellow, to the green, to the blue, to the indigo, to the violet. And that this is what makes up our world. This is the world we experience. In the same way with the sound, that in fact we experience it in the tones of the clear prime tones that we experience of sound. And they go from do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And that's how we experience it. And that it turns out that this is not coincidental. As it turns out that we are, in fact, the way we are, and we have evolved the particular faculties of experiential discernment that we have, in fact, evolved because of the structure of the band of frequency that we happen to manifest within. That we are, in fact, in part, the product of this phenomenon. It's not that, that we just happen to be able to get to see it. We are generated in order to experience this. And that it turns out that when all of those tones of clear light at those prime colors, and those tones of sound at those prime notes, when they manifest, they actually generate an overtone within the octave. And that an overtone is that which isn't the same as any one of the notes that are struck. But when they're struck in harmony, they generate a harmonic overtone. And everybody says, where does that come from? Or where is that? It's not at the same place of any one of the notes. It's at a different place. It exists in some kind of a realm as an overtone. And that is the overtone of consciousness that is generated within the vibrational frequency of the octave. And it's that consciousness that then manifests in the material form and does so in order to engage in the experience at that level. And what we've discovered is that in the same way that we have these chakras in our body, that the chakras that we have are 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th chakra are vibrational centers that are in us because we are, in fact, holographic manifestations of the very frequency of vibration that we manifest within. And what this 8th paradigm comes to tell us is that this octave that we find ourselves manifest in is just one octave. And so that when in fact we open the 8th chakra of our own experience, we in fact open onto the lower note of the next octave. In the same way that the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, the second do in the octave, is not only the top note of this octave, it is the low note of the next octave. And the same thing is true with our being. When we vibrate at the frequency of our 8th chakra, we in fact open onto the experience of the next octave of being. And that the 8th paradigm suggests that our universe is a serial set of octaves within which the frequencies are different, and to which one octave cannot in fact gain access to the other octave without in fact accelerating the vibrational frequency of their being. And that is the key to accessing the next octave of vibrational being. And this is where the beings come from. And that they can in fact, they've developed a technology of slowing down their vibrational frequencies such that they can actually access our lower octave. And that's why they just pop right into being and pop right out of being. Because as they slow down and accelerate their vibrational frequency, they come and go from this octave of being. And so that this is an extraordinarily important aspect of the cosmology of the 8th paradigm. But this cosmology, of course, completely shatters one of the pillar beliefs of the cosmological belief of all of these other worldviews within our octave, and that is that it denies the reality of the limitations of the ability to transport matter and mass and energy faster than the speed of light. It's a major premise of our worldviews, and it's shattered in preparation for moving into the next worldview that is beyond our octave. And so that it's important to understand that this universe is also the teleology of this worldview. That's the cosmology. The teleology of this worldview is, how does it unfold? Where is it going? How is it functioning? In what direction is it going? That it turns out that this, in fact, is symphonic. The universe is symphonic. And that within each of these octaves, each of these nodal points of sound or light manifests as experiences. Light, the experience of the color blue is an experience. It's not an idea, it's not a philosophy, it's an experience. The experience of a note, a pure note tone, is an experience. That's why we have access to it. And so that what we discover is that inside each of these octaves, the octave is characterized by experience of these manifestations, of these stepped full notes that exist inside that frequency. And that it's symphonic from one octave to another. And it is also harmonic. The simple fact of the matter is that it's what they call onic. And onic is a Greek word that actually means, and it's one of them that I had in here because it's a technical term, but it's extraordinarily important if I can find it, but I can't. But what it is that it means that each and every one of the pure experiences of sight or sound or some other experience, it's a different nature of that we've ever experienced in the next octave, is in fact one full stepped function, higher or lower than the other that manifests, of the underlying primary fundamental wavelength that exists inside that octave. Now, this means that it's onic. The teleology in the eighth paradigm is onic in that sense. And so you get to the question of what this does, of course, is it removes, very importantly, us from the center of the ultimate experience of the universe. We are experiencing it within our octave, and other beings are experiencing it within their octave. And there is an unfolding that is taking place within each of these octaves of the full coming into full frequency harmony of these beings, but that it's going on in a stepped serial fashion throughout the galaxy and throughout the universe. So that I want to close on this point of going through them, because another one of the things that distinguishes categorically each worldview from another is a different theory of human psychology. That's why you have Jungian psychology and Gestalt psychology and Freudian psychology. All these schools of psychology, they're generic to one or another of these particular worldviews. But the theory of psychology that's so important for the eighth paradigm worldview is to understand that based upon our belief of this categorically different nature of reality, that we are capable, through our own directed intentionality, of manifesting reality inside our own octave, of tuning the harmonic inside our own octave of being, such that it condenses and manifests in material form. And that we are capable, through an embracing of this belief system of the eighth paradigm worldview, to actually directly affect the structure of the DNA inside our own bodies. And that we are capable of mutating the DNA so that we can accelerate the actual evolution of our human family, so that we reach the next step of evolution into the next octave of being in a more rapid rate than it would otherwise take place simply arithmetically. And so that we actually have the capability of intervening in our own evolution to accelerate our own evolution. And this is what, in fact, has been taught to us by the prophets. The mutations who have occurred at different times in history, down through the last 10,000 years. This is why we've seen it in Jesus and in Muhammad and in the Buddha and in Kuan Yin and in Isis and in White Buffalo Calf Woman. These are beings who in fact have encountered this, have opened the 8th chakra of their being, and that they manifest light, they in fact radiate light, and they can in fact, they vibrate at that frequency, and they're attempting to tell us. Like Jesus of Nazareth said, look, it is not so important that you understand what I'm saying. It's important that you understand what I am. That I am the good news. That I am manifest where we will all come to. But you can participate in this great good news. That there are certain things that you can do that have to do with comporting your conduct in a certain way, certain type of dietary activities, a certain type of meditative activities where you in fact sit down and clear your consciousness from all of this static, all of this chitterary that is involved in throwing off your frequencies, to the point where you can actually consciously begin to accelerate the vibrational frequency of the energy fields that surround your body. And that you can, in fact, consciously do the same things that we do. To transmute one form of matter into another. To levitate and to move on water. Indeed, to heal people with one's very touch. Because it's a vibrational frequency that can retune the energy fields of their body, that control the material manifestations inside the field of consciousness. That this is the good news that has been conveyed to us over the centuries. And it's the good news that comes that we still continue to consider to be a mystery. These are the mysteries that stand before us. And that is why we still continue to insist that the question of whether or not extraterrestrial civilization exists and what the meaning of the UFO phenomena is also just a mystery. But when you come to understand that the latter two questions are not a mystery anymore, and when you answer these questions in a clear way that we share, you begin to understand what the other worldview looks like. And you begin to start to understand what the nature of the good news is, so that you can translate the good news from being a mystery to being the answer to that question as to what the purpose of your individual life is and what the purpose of our collective human species is, so that you can see the connection between these two profoundly important questions and the most profound questions that face us all in the face of being potentially struck down at any given moment in our lives without coming to these ultimate answers. So I ask you to remain steadfast with the courage of your convictions, to answer these questions in a clear and coherent way. But I ask you at the same time to move into understanding the full implications of this worldview, so that you too can stand before your friends and your family and tell them the good news. Thank you very, very much.